As I said, I'm so glad to have all of you here in person and on Zoom for today's special event. I believe that as part of the library's mission to be a center for community engagement, knowledge, and personal enrichment is to offer programs like today's. I believe the library is a place where we can uncover and share stories that perhaps have not been told or shared in their entirety. Now, that can sometimes mean discussing uncomfortable truths about our shared human history. And while today's program will cover some very difficult subject matter, it's important that we not only understand the facts of human history, but also understand that history involves real people who have their own personal stories to share, and that there is inspiration that can be found in those stories. And that's why I'm so glad to have Max Friedman here today to share the story of his parents and the journey he has taken to understand their lives and what shaped them. We are honored to be one of the first stops on his book tour. And please note that we do have copies of Mr. Friedman's book available for purchase and signing. And we will continue to have copies available here at the library for at least the next week, so that those of you now joining us on Zoom will have an opportunity to purchase a signed copy. As many of you know, this year, April 28th, yesterday, was the internationally recognized date for Holocaust Remembrance Day, and marks the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. And Mr. Friedman's new book, Painful Joy, was released yesterday to coincide with Holocaust Remembrance Day. I will, of course, let Max tell the rest of his deeply personal and incredible story of his family's journey of discovery, transformation, and acceptance. But before I turn things over to Max, I'd like you to know just a little bit more about him. As a journalist, writer, and author, Max Friedman has spent his working life discovering and then writing hundreds of stories about other people. After getting a BA from Columbia College and a Master's of Journalism from UC Berkeley, Max spent the next 5 decades first as a journalist and then in related writing fields, including public television, leading a communications group for a major pharmaceutical company, and operating his own editorial consultancy. He's married and has twin sons and 2 grandchildren. After spending a career discovering and then sharing the stories of so many others, he found himself re-examining his own past, spurred by a question from his grandson. The result is Painful Joy, an effort to finally uncover the truth of his parents' extraordinary journey of survival and the effects it had on others. So now please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Max Friedman.
Even lower, yes, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to thank you for your introduction and to Amy, who we've known forever and ever. Thank you, and to the Friends of the Port Washington Public Library for giving me this opportunity to be with you today. As Jeff said, my book was just published yesterday, and so this is the first time I'm really talking about it in public. And I have to admit, as you may be able to tell, that I'm both excited and nervous. In a way, it might be called a painful joy. So for today is a sunny, beautiful day here in Port Washington. Even better. Okay, thank you. Is that all right? Okay. And I'm going to take you on a journey that sometimes is very dark and very painful, but it does have its sunny moments. It has its odd characters, mostly my parents, and I think after we're all done, you'll get a better understanding not only of who they are and perhaps even of who I am, but of what it takes to survive and what it takes to adapt and what it takes sometimes to not be able to do either of those things, and where that leaves you. Yesterday, as Jeff said, was Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And it was the 79th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where about 13,000 Jews decided, as one said, to not allow the Germans alone to pick the time and place of our death. So they staged an uprising. About 250,000 other Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto had already been taken away and killed in Treblinka. These 13,000 kept the Germans at bay for a little over 40 days. Most of them were killed. The ones that survived were then murdered, but a few actually did make it out. And I think when we talk about survival and survival after the Holocaust, we're really talking about a fight for freedom, freedom of oneself, of their families, and given what's going on in Ukraine today, it's a timely talk and it's something worth thinking about. And I would encourage you, actually, when I started doing my research, I kept thinking in very large numbers, and then it came to me that the best way to consider what happened is to think about every soul, every person as an individual. Learning their names makes a very big difference in how you think about them. And as we talk, I think you'll see that more and more. First, we have our main characters. This is Sam and Frida Friedman, my parents. They've been gone now for about a quarter of a century, and I spent the last 6 years now being with them, but in a different way, maybe in a better way, actually, as you'll hear, researching and writing their story, my own family history, and to find out more about how what they survived still touches us in some way. In the picture here, it's a picture taken in Halmstad, Sweden, which is on the west coast of Sweden in the south, and it's where they married and where my sister and I were born. I'll tell you how they got to Sweden in a little bit. Now, they look wonderful, and this would be sort of odd when I first saw this picture, because for 6 months right before, they had just been liberated from Bergen-Belsen, and they had survived 6 years of being beaten and watching everybody that they ever knew and loved vanish, either into trains or transport somewhere else, or directly into various camps. They didn't know ultimately when it would be their turn, or when the last moment of their life would just be the next moment. And so they were survivors. So they look good. But what I found out is looks are deceiving. And what was going on inside of them was very different, and was very different for the rest of their lives. What I'm going to talk about is obviously Europe. What you see here, these red areas, are where they lived and worked and grew up. Right, this is the border actually with Ukraine, and that's where my mother was born. My father was born a little bit off, and then there are other places like Krakow where they lived, or near where they lived. These red marks are, for the most part, where they were imprisoned. And then, whoops, sorry. Well, the other red marks represent Sweden. The first half of this book is about each of my parents and the journey that they each took separately, and then when they met in Sweden. The second half is basically about the effects that their survival had on each of them, and then on my sister and me, and perhaps even on future generations, like my children and even my grandchildren. When I first started, I didn't know anything, really, literally, just anything about their lives. The dates that I thought they were born were not the right dates. Where they were born were not the right places. What they said they did when they were young, or even during the war, either was not ever spoken about or was not what was. So what I knew about myself was where I began. And what I knew about myself was that I had a Swedish birth certificate, that I had citizenship papers from this country, dated 1957, and that I knew ultimately that their lives and my life was not normal. And so I decided to figure out what their lives were all about and how that affected me. I did this slide a little sooner than I wanted to, but anyway, this is a picture of populations of Jews in various countries in Europe in 1939. And as you could see, except for the United States, which is not on this map, and Russia, which has a very large Jewish population at the time, probably higher than this map shows, Poland actually had more Jews in it than anywhere else in the world. Yet by 1945, only between 3 and 4% of all the Jews who had lived in Poland and who remained alive in the German-administered part of Poland was still alive. So it's 3 or 4%, which means that more than 95 or of every 100 of the Jews in Poland were murdered. So they survived. So it's a story, obviously, about survival and what it meant to survive the Holocaust and what it meant to live in the shadow of the Holocaust for themselves and, again, for my sister and for myself for the rest of their lives, and I think for the rest of my life, too. They were the first generation Holocaust survivors, so they led the way. They set examples for us, for my sister, for me. And sometimes that was a good thing, and sometimes not so much. I'm called a second generation Holocaust survivor. What does that mean? It describes our own struggles, my sister's, and my own struggle to survive my parents' survival. And you'll learn more about that as we go along. And the second is it commits us to help keep the stories of these Holocaust survivors alive, passing down their memories, their histories, and the meaning of their survival to everyone that's to come. So, this is the Grand Hotel in Halmstad. It's where my father found himself about 5 months in after the war, and it sets the stage for what came next. So I'd like to read you the opening of the book. And he is working there. He was a stranger in a strange land, but that had been his life for some time, because what had happened to him and to those he loved, nothing would ever be the same again. He knew that. It was late at night on February 2nd, 1946, and my father, Max Friedman, we can call him Sam Friedman for the sake of this talk, because that's what he was called once he came to the United States, 34 years old, had just finished washing the dishes at the only job a Swedish refugee agency could get for him. He was the kind of man who thanked God for any work because he believed every blessing he received came from his God. Most days he remained thankful just to be alive after what he had seen, lost, and endured for nearly 6 years that had just passed. Sitting in a small room he shared with 3 other Polish Jewish refugees from the camps, he started to compose a letter. Here he was in Sweden of all places, free at last, safe at last, but still not free to live the life he had once known and cherished. A few months earlier, something that had happened gave him a new measure of comfort and a glimpse of the possibility of a better future. He had met someone, Now he was trying to help her return to the world as he sought to do himself. Maybe she would become a part of his world as well. So to get help, he wrote a letter. This letter. It's a letter that I found in the Swedish National Archives amongst hundreds and hundreds of pages. And fortunately, I had the letter translated. It was written in Yiddish. It was written by him to a lawyer in Stockholm who was helping refugees at the time. This is a translation of some of that letter. As I begin writing to you, writing to the lawyer, I'm asking that you give me the wise answer, not only for myself, but also for a woman who endured the worst suffering in the camps. It was only a matter of a few days or she would have been a victim like all the others. Certainly, it was fate that she survived, and she is once again a human being like everyone else. My name is Friedman, and the woman I mentioned is also a Friedman. I'll explain that later. She was married 8 months before the war. Up to now, she has not located her husband. When I came to Mole on December 10th, I made her acquaintance. After only several days, we began to fall in love with one another, and we spent our time together. We had decided to remain together if we do not find our spouses. We would actually cohabit until people in these circumstances will be permitted to marry. His question was how the lawyer could help Frida make it to America if he himself was fortunate enough to get permission to emigrate. And then a quote, his concluding quote. If you help me in this matter, these two people who have endured so much will be happy because of you. Perhaps it is too soon for me to be thinking about her. Unfortunately, things don't go a way a person would like. So, unfortunately, things don't go the way a person would like. An understatement. Is what follows a love story? In a certain way, I suppose so. Perhaps that was the biggest surprise of the book for me, to discover that they loved each other, at least at the beginning of their relationship. It was not something an observer would easily conclude watching the two of them together years later. Yet, as we will see, it was a love that was so often touched by death and despair. What surrounded that love always was a measure of painful joy. Allow me to explain. For the entire time I was growing up, and in fact until I started researching this book 6 years ago, I saw my parents in a very one-dimensional way. Two very damaged human beings, harmed irrevocably by the losses they suffered and the horrors they endured from 1939 to 1945. I knew virtually nothing about them and their lives before the Holocaust, little about what actually happened during the war years and how they survived. All I knew is that they lost every single member of each of their families except one, my mother's sister, Genya, my Aunt Jenny, who survived thanks to my mother, and I'll tell you a little bit about that soon. I knew as well that they had been in prison in ghettos and concentration camps and that they met and married in Sweden sometime after their liberation. Not much else, and really not much to go on. If truth be told, I never really wanted to know anymore, and my older sister, Rachel, wanted to know even less. Those memories were devastating to them, and in their own ways, they caused us pain. In the movie A Few Good Men, Jack Nicholson's character is being cross-examined by the Tom Cruise character about an incident at a military base. Nicholson's character, Colonel Jessup, asks Cruise, who plays the prosecuting attorney, "You want answers?" Cruise yells back, "I want the truth." Jessup responds, "You can't handle the truth." I don't think my sister and I could have handled the truth back then. It was enough, I thought, that we spent our childhoods being what someone once called child parents, taking care of our father and mother even when they were supposed to be taking care of us. We would wake them from their nightmares. We would try to intercede and calm them after their endless fights. We would make sure that our TV was never turned to anything to do with war, and certainly not with concentration camps. We felt so bad for them that we pretty much did whatever they wanted us to do, even when we knew it made no sense at all. It was easier that way. We believed them and we believed in them. After all, they were our parents. But ours was not a normal family. And what about handling the truth? My father once told me a single story about his past, only one, and otherwise never mentioned the war during his lifetime. The truth was obviously something much more and more complicated for him as well. And there were always surprises along the way about what the truth really was. My mother, on the other hand, focused every day on recalling concentration camp memories, along with a few fantastical stories about once owning a dance studio. Her concentration camp stories were the most disturbing. The truth is that the only bedtime, indeed any time stories we ever heard, from the time we were very young, were very different from those of other children. No Goodnight Moon for us. No Pat the Bunny. No Dr. Seuss. Instead, it was characters like Joseph Mengele, the angel of death at Auschwitz, or Amon Get, the butcher of Plochow, or about starving in Bergen-Belsen, where Anne Frank and her sister died. My mother was imprisoned in each of these camps, and her memories were often vivid, if sometimes reimagined. And that's where, as I researched the past, new questions began to appear. And I started to question what was real and what was fantasy, or a better way of saying it, reimagined reality. At the same time, I have to admit my empathy for them and what they experienced increased exponentially. I began to understand the why of their lives, not just the what and the when. Every fact and every memory that was uncovered had a reason. And that exploration and what I discovered took on new dimensions. And as a reader, I think and I hope you'll begin to experience that as well and become fascinated to learn more. I think you'll also be surprised by the amount of empathy that will generate in you and the amount of emotions that you begin to experience. For example, when I first discovered birth records of my father's two daughters, his first family, and learned their names, Ada and Fegla, and how old they were when they went to the gas in Auschwitz. Ada was 4.5 and Fegla 1.5. I wept. As you can tell, I still feel a certain way about it. The same thing happened when I saw the face of Jacob Goldman, my mother's father. He's on the far right in that picture. He was my grandfather. It was in a museum exhibit just one day after I had seen the picture on the right, which was from an archive in Krakow. Even calling him my grandfather for the first time, and this was in 2018, October of 2018, suddenly sent a chill through my body. And it still does. Until then, I would always say that I didn't have any grandparents. But of course I did. Everybody has grandparents. I just didn't know them. And suddenly, from one day to the next, that all changed. And what became apparent as I searched day in and day out in virtual archives and actual archives from Sweden and Poland, consulting with experts and genealogists, and even traveling to Poland, to Sweden, to Germany, and to Israel, was that there was much more to tell and much more to learn, and also that much would just be unknowable. For the next few minutes, I will begin by just introducing each of them to you and telling you a bit of their story. There's more to tell, but we only have an hour, not a year. So we'll start. This is my father. He was about 17. He was born Max Friedman. Again, we'll just call him Sam. He was born in 1911 in Jarnovich, which was a small shtetl, a village of about 2,000 people, half of whom were poor Jewish traders, shopkeepers, and craftsmen and their families, and the other 1,000 poor Polish Catholic farmers and their families. The village was in southwestern Poland, not very far in distance, only about 40 miles, from Krakow, which is the second largest city in Poland. Yet it was worlds away from that city. Zarnovich and the surrounding area had come under control of the Tsarist Russian Empire in the 1800s and stayed that way till the Polish Republic was created after World War I. Sam's father, his name was Milech, or king in Yiddish, and I was named after him, was a trader, a merchant without a shop, but instead conducting his business on market days in the village's central square, like this one. He would trade goods like kitchenware or other supplies to the local farmers and in return get their produce and sell them in larger markets outside of the city. At his birth, my father's family consisted of 3 older sisters, 2 of whom were twins, 2 older brothers, and later there would be a younger brother. The family barely eked out a living, as was true for most of the Jewish population in Poland at that time. But a few years after Sam was born, World War I erupted, and fighting between the Russians and Germans came too close to Zarnovich, leading the family to seek safety in a larger city nearby, Bengin, where many members of my father's family lived for generations. Bengin was a cosmopolitan city of about 60,000, half of whom were Jews. It was a wonderful place to live and grow up during the 1920s and early 1930s. It was an important city of life and culture for Jews. A flourishing Zionist movement was there, and a vibrant commercial enterprise. But then tragedy struck. Just a year after they arrived, Milech, my father's father, died suddenly at the age of 45. Now, I know I'm talking about my father first, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity for you to meet my mother. Just a bit. You have to hear how my mother described Sam's father's death to us when we were young, to get a feel for who she really was or how she thought about the world. Of course, she didn't know whether what she told us was even true, but that really didn't matter. Here's what I wrote in the book. Frida would begin by pointing to the edge of the metal table where we sat eating our meals in the tiny kitchen of our Coney Island apartment where we lived when we first came to the U.S. "I'm telling you, so listen," she would intone to Rachel and me, generally her only captive audience, in an excessively loud and sometimes deeper voice than her small frame would imply. "Always be careful, I'll tell you why. One day, Schlamek's father," Schlamek was my father's Yiddish name, "was just standing in the kitchen where they lived in Poland and didn't pay any attention to what he was doing. So he fell down hard and hit his side, pointing to her own hip, on the edge of the table, just like this." She raised her voice along with her hand and she slapped the corner of the table. Then the lesson ended. He dropped down on the floor and just died. No one could help him. That scene would be repeated many times in my younger years, first about the mortal dangers inherent in sharp table edges, and second, to let us know, more importantly, that our lives were always in mortal peril. Frida's voice then grew even louder and more emphatic. Waving her hands menacingly, she warned, "So listen to me. Be careful and watch out for corners on tables, and don't fall down." Not quite fodder for a fortune cookie, but just another thing for 2 little kids to worry about in a rundown apartment facing an alley at the back of a shoe store, a block from the unending roar of elevated subway trains. That was our life back then. Here is my father's family when he was about 20. He's on the right, as you're looking at the picture of the woman in the center, and that's his mother. There are the three girls, and one of the rest of the males was his younger brother. I don't know which, and I don't know who the others were. These were only a few pictures who ever survived. They were sent to my father's first cousins who had left for the United States in the 1920s, and he had sent it to them, or his family had sent it to them, and that's how they even survived the war. And the one thing I think you should look at is my father always told us that he was extremely religious, Orthodox Jewish, as was most of the Jews in Poland at the time. Yet what you see is a fully assimilated family. You see legs on the girls and arms that are uncovered, and that would not have been the case. So when I saw this picture for the first time, I started to think that maybe there was something more going on here about what my father thought his past was, reimagined, and what it really was. So one of the things I learned about this when we talk about survival is that, in fact, survival for him meant adaptation. And he could easily adapt. And he would tell us about and tell others about how religious he was. And he became very religious once he came to the United States. But before then, I think he was who he was expected to be, one way or another. Anyway, next, we have him moving to Dąbrowa Górnicza, which was a little industrial town known for its coal reserves in Upper Silesia, Poland. And he worked in a shop as a clerk in a retail store. The person who ran the store was actually the person who would become his first wife, Kaya Kotlicki. The Kotlickis, on her father's side, and the Parasols on her mother's side were actually quite wealthy. They lived in a large family compound with a cook, several maids, and their own prayer house, their own synagogue. And when we visited Dąbrowa in 2018, instead of the family compound and the house, what we found was a Soviet palace of culture, which had replaced that house. But in any case, somehow Sam and Chaya married in 1937, and they had their first child, Ada, a year later. It was around that time, the second half of the 1930s, that a nationwide economic boycott of Jewish stores began, spurred on by a renewed wave of anti-Semitism and encouraged by a nationalistic right-wing government in Poland that was seeking to reduce the number of Jews by 85%, mostly through emigration, unlike their neighbor, Germany. Next door, Germans were being much more aggressive about how to reduce the population of Jews. So even when Sam and Chaya were just starting out, because of the economic boycott, they faced enormous economic challenges. But then the world turned upside down, totally. In September 1939, Poland is invaded by Germany and by Russia. Within a few days, Dąbrowa and Będzin were both occupied by German troops. In Będzin, Jews were being shot in the streets. Especially targeted were any Jewish men with beards. The synagogue in Dąbrowa was quickly shuttered, and the great synagogue of Będzin was torched, with worshipers still inside and those in nearby houses forced back into the fires to be burned alive. Within a few months, all Jews in Poland were ordered to wear Stars of David on their arms. They were now officially identifiable as the others. Very quickly, my father and any other able-bodied Jews were put to work on various projects. And by the middle of 1940, Sam was sent to the first of 3 slave labor camps, this one in Graditz, which was deep into Germany. Then he was transferred to a second camp, at least closer to home, assigned to heavy labor and construction, moving cement blocks. As difficult as the conditions were, during the first year of the German occupation, I discovered, and I was surprised by this, that my father was actually allowed to return home for a few weekends during the course of the year, and then just was told to return to the camp. And while the camp was horrible, after all, his family were the hostages that were held in the Jewish ghetto there, so he did return. And as a result of being with his wife at the time, his second daughter was born in June 1941. Her name was Fegla, as I said. That's Yiddish for little bird. If only she could have flown away. In August 1942, while my father was now in yet a third camp, Bunzlau, also deep in Germany, his wife and 2 children were deported to Auschwitz and gassed. It was August 17th. This is a picture of a selection taking place in Dumbrova just a few months earlier to identify those to be sent to be murdered. Once Bunzlau was converted into a concentration camp, conditions worsened considerably for my father. He worked in the rock quarries, and eyewitness accounts of beatings my father endured came to light only a few months before this book went to press. And so I had enough time to actually enter into the book some specifics about what happened to him in Bunzlau. One of the things that he would do in the camp was to try to keep warm. It was very cold, and so he was working in the quarries, and there were cement sacks that were empty. And he would put the empty cement sack under his shirt as an undershirt to keep himself a little bit warmer. That was against the rules. There was a particular German criminal who became a capo, or head of his group in the camp, named Ossi. Ossi would discover the cement sack under his shirt and would start beating him till he was unconscious, usually around the head and usually with a spiked club. Ossi in 1980 was actually sought by the West German government as a war criminal. However, by then he had disappeared. My father stayed in Bunzlau for 3 years. So I just cannot fathom how one could even survive that, and at the same time survive the fact that he didn't know what had happened to his wife and his children. He was already in Bunzlau when they were taken to Auschwitz. So he was thinking about them even as he was being beaten. But again, the choice for him always was whether to freeze to death or to be beaten to death. And you freeze to death today, maybe you're beaten to death tomorrow. Those were the kind of choices that many of the survivors had to make. In the harsh winter of February 1945, as the Soviet armies were approaching Bunzlau and the other camps, the camps were being evacuated and prisoners were being moved further east. My father, wearing only wooden clogs, thin pants, and the shirt on his back, was marched with several hundred other prisoners for 6 weeks, northeast through Germany toward Bergen-Belsen. And many obviously died along the way from exposure, from illness, from starvation, or just being shot for not keeping up. Bergen-Belsen was extraordinarily frightening. It had started out as a POW camp, and when it became a concentration camp in 1943, it held around 7,300 prisoners. By the time my father arrived, there were probably around 50,000 people there. And by the time the war ended, there were 60,000 who had been in the camp. Now again, 37,000 of them had died there. 13,000 actually after the camp was liberated. And those who came to liberate the camp found these unburied corpses everywhere. So imagine again that you're my father, and he had just left a circle of hell, and he enters this circle of hell. In mid-April, when the British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen, it evacuated the prisoners and then burned the concentration camp to the ground to prevent the spread of typhus, which was an epidemic going through all the people in the camp. After being interviewed, Sam was selected, probably because he had relatives in the US and wanted to emigrate there anyway, to be transported to Sweden, where he was to recuperate for 6 months with other survivors, and then he was supposed to move away from Sweden to another country, back to Poland or anywhere else. It was up to him to figure that out. His family, as I said before, he had a few first cousins who had left in the 1920s during some pogroms in Poland, and so he had that family there. He went through a number of alien camps, which is what he was put into, as were the other survivors, in Sweden, until they could figure out what to do with them. And he was at the same time trying to find out what happened to his family. No one was ever found. Yet in one of those camps, as I read to you, he met Frida Friedman. So this is one of those camps. Not bad, it's certainly compared to where he had come from. Frida Friedman. Frida Friedman was born Frimet Endenburg in 1910 in Sieniawa, also a small shtetl, but this time on the other side of Poland, in its southeastern corner, just a few miles from the border with Ukraine. We'll call her Frida, which is the name she would adopt years later. Sieniawa is in a region of Galicia not too far from the border, and this is a look at the market square there. It was part not of Tsarist Russia, but of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which I think was a good thing. Her father, Jacob Goldman, who we saw before, was a tailor, and her mother was Ruchela Endenburg. Both these pictures actually came from German ID cards taken in 1940. Jacob, my middle name and my grandson's given name, had to do a lot of tailoring to support what turned out to be a family of 13 children. Those 6 of them never made it to adulthood. The odd thing was, as I did my research, is my mother never mentioned him at all, ever, not a word. I never really did figure out why. I have some ideas, but it was very odd. After nearly every birth, the family, as it kept growing, would move to a slightly larger 1 or 2 room little house off the market square. And my mother, actually, was born in that house. So go figure. You can find out all the things you really didn't know you could, and maybe didn't really mean all that much anyway. In searching the records, though, what I found was that one of these children was born not in Sieniawa, but in Prague. So I wondered, Prague was 450 miles away. What were they doing there? As it turned out, what they were doing there was, once again, surviving. They were refugees, this time from World War I. This is a picture taken from a British newspaper at the time showing the fighting that was going on right outside of Shinyava. And so again, they became refugees, and it took them almost a day to get to Prague, but they stayed in Prague. And here is a picture of actually refugees leaving a shtetl and then hanging around in Prague. And they stayed there actually for 5 years, living either in a refugee camp or initially on the streets. After the war ended, they moved to the Kazimierz section of Krakow, which was the traditional Jewish quarter. On the left is what that quarter looked like then, and on the right is actually what it looks like today. One of the dislocating things about being a refugee is that my mother went to grade school when they moved back to Kazimierz. However, she was 5 years older than all the other girls. So she already was finding herself sort of an other in a very modest way, but in a difficult way, and I think it affected her as she grew older. They rented an apartment in this building. This is Josepha 12. Now, the interesting thing about Josepha 12 is, and she lived there with her first husband, who I'll get to in a second, and was that, I don't know how many of you, probably most of you, saw Schindler's List at one point or other. This is the building that Steven Spielberg used as the set for the ghetto, the Krakow ghetto. Indeed, it was not in the Krakow ghetto, it was on the other side of the river. But he used that, and it became one of the more familiar scenes that people got to know. Whenever you go to museums in Krakow, you always see this building. Yet it was, my mother and her family lived on the second floor balcony facing the street. Behind that balcony facing the street. This is a scene from Schindler's List, and you can see that building very clearly as, according in this scene, the Krakow ghetto is being liquidated, which happened in 1943. And here I am actually sitting outside the balcony watching Schindler's List in that very place that you see on the screen. Yeah. It was something else to experience. Now, my mother would get married, and right before the war began in 1938, she married the man on the left. His name happened to be Abe Friedman. So there you have it. That mystery was solved. And they got married in the Alta, which is a word for old, synagogue in Kazimierz. That's the interior, that's the exterior. Frida always claimed that her husband was a very rich dance studio owner, and that she became an operator of the dance studio. I'll tell you why that wasn't true. In any case, before I get to that, the Germans, after they invaded Poland, decided that Warsaw was no longer going to be the capital of Poland. Instead, Krakow was going to be. The problem was that there were 60,000 Jews in Krakow. This was not acceptable. So immediately, as soon as they arrived, the Germans transported about 45,000 Jews out of Krakow to what were called transit ghettos all around Poland as they were waiting for concentration camps to be built. And once they were built, all those Jews were murdered in those camps. My mother's 3 brothers and their families were put on those transports out of Krakow. My mother and several other members of her family actually were allowed to stay in Krakow, at least for a time. These were 2 of her brothers, Abraham on the left and Naphtali on the right. Also her sister, her only sister, Genya, on the right. In fact, as you can see here, which is a pile of luggage, the reason why my mother and her husband were spared is because Abe Friedman was an essential worker. His job was to make luggage. And that's what he actually did for a living. He worked for a Jewish man who had a luggage store in Krakow. And because they needed him to make luggage for the Jews who were taking one piece of luggage each to the trains and then to the camps where they were to be killed, they needed him. So for a while, he was allowed to actually even live outside of the Krakow ghetto in order to go to his workplace. In the Krakow ghetto, which opened up in 1941 and then was liquidated in 1943, my mother first made bricks, and then she worked in a clothing factory making German uniforms. She was actually fortunate in that job because an Austrian ran the factory and actually was a friend of Oskar Schindler's and treated Jews actually quite nicely compared to what they were treated, how they were treated otherwise. So she was there for a bit, and that was good. But then she wasn't. And she and her husband and most of her family were sent to Plaszow, which was a slave labor camp and then a concentration camp in the outskirts of Krakow. Her father joined him there. When the ghetto was liquidated in 1943, her mother, who was too old to work, was not sent to Plaszow, but was killed on the streets in Krakow, in the ghetto, among 2,000 other Jews who were murdered then, and 3,000 others who were taken to Auschwitz to be killed. In Plaszow, she had the unfortunate fortune of being in a place that was commanded by Amon Get. Get would routinely, before breakfast, randomly kill inmates, either shooting them from his villa window or nearby. He would follow up later in the day, killing inmates for any other reason. He once killed a tall Jew because he was too tall. He killed somebody because they were resting for a minute. And he just did it because he liked it. In fact, in 1944, the Nazis took away his command of Plaszow because he broke the rules and how cruel he could be to the inmates. Imagine having rules about how cruel you can be. In any case, a crazy, crazy time. Sadly, Amon Get, as my mother would call her, became part of our vocabulary when we were children. Over time, the remaining members of my mother's family who were in Plaszow were either sent to Mauthausen or Buchenwald. They were there to either be worked to death or to be killed. And as the Russians closed in, my mother was actually sent with her sister Genya to Auschwitz. Her father stayed. There was a small group of Jews who stayed to try to erase any evidence of what had happened in Plaszow. And then they were marched to Auschwitz and killed there. And so that my grandfather, Jacob, almost made it. The Russians had come about 2 weeks after he had arrived in Auschwitz. Here is the entrance to Auschwitz. There's Jenny, my wife, and there's the famous sign, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. Now, with her is a guy named Giles Bennett, who flew down to walk with us. He's a Holocaust researcher who lives in Munich and had been to Auschwitz many times. And even as we walked through with him, he couldn't help but cry. At Auschwitz, my Mengele again is on the right. And at Auschwitz, my mother would tell us that she was actually the selection when she got off the train as to who would live and who would die, who would go to the left and who would go to the right, that Mengele was in charge of her selection. And as it turned out, everything that I could find out was actually the time she came, he was there doing selection. So it is very likely for changed. My mother actually told us the truth about that. And the other interesting thing about this selection was that my mother was selected to live, and her sister was selected to die. And they neither knew that at the time, but my mother was very intuitive, and she saw what was happening, and she saw who was going one way and who was going the other. And it occurred to her that her sister was going with a lot of old people and a lot of children. And this didn't seem like a good thing. So she actually, in the midst of all this, ran across and grabbed her sister and pulled her across to the other side. The dogs were set upon them, but they made it, and they stayed together through their time in Sweden. So she did a very good thing and saved her sister's life. I show you this picture of the crematorium, not to depress you even more, but really it was one of four, but it just is part of the story because while terrible things happened, and after people were gassed, their bodies were taken to the crematorium to be disposed of, up to 1,400 bodies an hour. The ovens created so many ashes that we were told when we were there that the ground we walked on were the ashes of those bodies. So in effect, we walked on our family. And a sobering and very difficult thought even now to begin to appreciate. In late 1944, this is Bergen-Belsen now, another horror, another picture of the horror you saw before. My mother was sent to Auschwitz, from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, again during the evacuation of all these camps. There was the typhus, there was the starvation, and my mother developed typhus, and was sent eventually to Sweden, and this is the quarantine hospital in Sweden, where she is the woman in the center of the picture. And if you looked at the sign there, and it actually in Swedish said, "Do not pass quarantine." So this is a nice bucolic picture. This is a picture of where my mother and father met, in Mole, which was a fishing village in southern Sweden. And they met in this hotel where about 400 refugees were being housed at the time. So since they were both Friedmans, the story was that's how they met somehow. My mother has one version of the story. I discovered another version. But in any case, there was something about being Friedmans, both. So perhaps it was fate. Sometimes I have to admit, given their rocky relationship, perhaps it was a mistake. Now, they continued to search for their loved ones, as indicated in that letter that my father wrote. And this is actually a picture taken in Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, of a card that my father filled out, still looking for his wife, his two children, and two of his sisters. And he didn't know what had happened to them, as we know, though I'll tell you a little bit more later about that. And the picture was taken, we were at Yad Vashem because we actually found a niece of my father's on his first wife's side, who we never discovered till I began this research. And she actually worked as an historian at Yad Vashem, and we met her there in 2018 as well. In any case, they move, they get married in Sweden, and they have my sister in 1947. There is no picture of me, because I didn't like pictures, in 1950. And then actually, today is my birthday, so celebrating with memories and with everybody here is as good a way as any I know, to celebrate the past and to look toward the future. We took the SS Gripsholm to Sweden. It was paid for by Hayas, the Swedish, the Jewish Refugee Agency. And here is one of the first pieces of evidence we had about our past, which is the passenger manifest, which shows the four of us being stateless, which is what we were. We had no passports at that time, not Swedish, not Polish, nothing. We arrived and we lived in Coney Island. And this is a picture of the street that we lived on. It was a 2.5-room apartment with 1 bathroom, an alley, and elevated subway lines. It was a block from the boardwalk, and the Cyclone and the Wonder Wheel and the beach. So it was a wonderful place, you would think, for a child to grow up in. Other children, yes. Us, not so much. We had no money, so rides were out of the question. Rides were also out of the question because my parents were afraid of everyone and everything, especially that we would get hurt. So we were never allowed on any of the fun rides. And I think my sister and I adopted some of those fears. Here's my family in those early years when my father worked as a shipping clerk in a warehouse in East New York. Eventually, my parents got a modest sum for reparations from the Germans. They bought a 4-family house, and we moved to Brighton Beach. And this time we had an apartment facing the street, and my mother could smoke cigarettes in secret on the Sabbath, and I slept on a sofa bed, but that's where I always slept, in the living room. And here they are in 1965. I'll digress just a little bit about what life was like for us. None of us knew a normal life while we were in Coney Island or in Brighton Beach, though the neighborhood was safer in Brighton Beach. We were very poor. My father never made more than about $250 a week. And my parents received a very small stipend from the German government, beginning at around $30 a month. They fought constantly, mostly over money and over what my mother thought was my father's lack of ambition. And they rarely seemed happy with each other. And as much as my father tried to forget everything that had happened, my mother would never let him forget what they had lost, their youth, their families, their futures. And in the process, my mother tried to rework my sister's life to better reflect Frida's own personality and fantasies. So my sister could not be who she wanted to be, only who my mother had hoped for herself that she would become. It was a strange and sad and hurtful time. It didn't go well for them. It didn't go well for us. In fact, Frida and Sam clearly dealt with too many demons for any individual to bear. And as much as they loved and lost, the ghosts of the past continued to haunt them. For my mother, it was all about reliving those memories. For my father, it was all about forgetting them. Living in the shadow of the Holocaust affected my sister and me in the same ways as well. When she had a family, Rachel never wanted a dog because of the images my mother fed her about the dogs ripping apart young children and old women. To this day, Rachel still has a hard time giving blood because of the tourniquet that's put around your arm sometimes, and because images come back of people hanging, as my mother would describe them, in the camps. Sometimes even going into a shower for my sister was difficult because people were led into the showers before they were gassed. Early in my career, I coped with an outrageous boss by mimicking my parents and trying to survive his abuse rather than simply leaving and escaping. Till I was in 6th grade, I was afraid of nearly everyone because I didn't think that they were Jewish. And sometimes I was afraid to identify myself as Jewish. Our stress levels were out of whack, for lots of reasons, mostly related to to what we got through breast milk from our mother. And we still have panic attacks too often. I hate when movies don't end happily. And I do anything to avoid a fight or a confrontation or even loud shouting, because I had heard too much. Anyway, just to complete the story, my sister meets her future husband, they marry, they have children, and they move to Mobile, Alabama. I graduate college, marry, go to grad school, and we raise our family in Larchmont. And for perhaps a few years, things go okay with my parents. Rachel is far away now, which wasn't really good for my mother, because my mother used to take care of her kids while Rachel worked. But she felt okay. Sam retires after a heart attack. They go to Israel, a long-held dream of my father's. But then they get, someone breaks into their room and steals all their stuff. There you go. To keep in shape and keep their minds off each other in the past, they took long walks on the boardwalk. They actually seemed happy. My father would volunteer as a waiter in a senior center, and Frida got her dream of having a dance studio by teaching dance to people in the senior center. But then life interfered again. A series of incidents made us believe that there was something terribly wrong with my father, and the diagnosis was Alzheimer's disease. Probably caused in part, at least, by the concussions and beatings that he experienced in Bunzlau. His disease progressed, and in 1991, they moved to Mobile to be near my sister. There, my mother told her stories of concentration camps to anyone who would listen to her. The postman, the landlord, college students lived next door, anyone. And as a Holocaust survivor, she became a bit of a celebrity, at least on Holocaust Remembrance Day, when she would talk about her time in Auschwitz. Here they are, sort of toward the end of my father's life. And here's my mother, just a year before she died. And you can see the love of her grandson. This is one of my sister's sons, but also the anguish in her. In less than a month, she died in May 1998, an event marked by a front-page story in the Mobile Register. Then my family actually went to Sweden in 1998 because I started to think that I should know more. And I didn't pursue that effort very much, but we did go there and we met a woman who knew my mother and knew my father and spoke about them and even had pictures of us in her apartment. So it was extraordinary. And a reporter wrote the story of the four of us visiting. If I had more time, I could tell you a lot more. I just want to offer two selections from the book that are later and that give you a sense, again, of who my mother and father were. One was my mother, who was very superstitious, and she believed in the evil eye. So here she is, experiencing with us, talking to us about the evil eye. From my mother's perspective, every place was a battlefield, and every person, especially a fellow Jew, a potential enemy. Jealousy was to be found everywhere, and if there was a target, from her perspective, it was going to be one of the Friedmans. Our mother's aim was to protect us with whatever weapons and forces that she could. We had very little money, and I never was clear about why anyone would want anything from us. However, we had targets painted on our backs. And on rare occasions, when we went out to attend a bar mitzvah or a wedding or some other social gathering, we were being scrutinized by others. My mother was certain others wanted what we had. Once, when we arrived home from one of these events, before we could even take our party clothes off, such as they were, my mother would run to the sink, fill a glass with warm water, throw in some breadcrumbs, sprinkle in some salt, and rush over to us. Then she would dip her index finger into the glass and with it touch our temples and foreheads and then circle our heads with the glass several times, saying something like "Tch-tch-tch," while spitting lightly into the air. She would conclude the incantation by saying the magic words, "Keine Horror." Her aim, of course, was to protect us from the envy or jealousy of anyone, that is, from the evil eye. Clearly, from my mother's perspective, everybody wanted what we had. Her chants were, because we were never kidnapped, our clothes and other worldly possessions were never taken, and certainly we were safe, thanks to my mother and her magic. The second excerpt relates to the 20 minutes that I spent with my father hearing about his past when he was 20 years old. I said before it was the only time he ever told us anything. It was only years later that I came to understand what he really meant. Late in August 1970, when I was a senior in college, I found myself worrying about the possibility that I would be drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. I had drawn a low number in a draft lottery, so being a student would not protect me. However, I had recently learned I might be able to avoid wartime service, something called an emotional draft deferment. I needed to get my father to tell me more about the war. A few days before I was to appear before the draft board to make a case, I sat down with my father to hear his story for the first time in my life. Here's what he told me. It was August 1942, and the German soldiers were rounding up Jews where we lived. They told us to bring one suitcase each and to assemble in the town square. We were afraid and worried of being sent into the unknown, so we decided to hide from the soldiers in an attic near where we lived. That night, I went out to organize some food. We had two little girls, one who was still a baby. But when I returned, they were all gone. The next day, the Germans arrested me. The only thing they left me on the floor of that attic was my wife's sweater. I took that with me and kept it with me in the concentration camp. I didn't know for certain what had happened to them. I was so worried. But what could I do? And what ends up happening, sadly, is that he finds on a death march to Bergen-Belsen that his wife had been gassed and that she had died in Auschwitz. He leaves the sweater in the barn where they were sleeping that night. So, to conclude, my mother spent her whole life trying to be someone else and ultimately trying to recreate her life through her daughter. My father spent the rest of his life after the Holocaust trying to forget the past, ironically dying of Alzheimer's disease. His last words to me and to my wife and children were spoken in Yiddish, his mother tongue. He said, "I know I love you. I just don't know why." I guess that's the point. Sometimes there's no explanation for love or survival, how it happens, how to make it happen, what to learn from it. Sometimes things just are. There are lessons to be learned in that and hopefully in this book for all of us. At the end of the day, this is a story I wrote about my father. At the end of the day, if it weren't for Sam and Frida, there would be no us. And that is certainly true for 18 of the 23 people you see in this picture, my family on my parents' side, who only came into this world because Sam and Frida survived and met each other in a little Swedish town called Mole. Finally, as another Mobile Register article devoted to my parents reminded us 2 months after Frida died, in a story featuring my sister, for the sake of Frida and Sam, for all the survivors and generations to come, please never forget. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Max. I want to tell you that in terms of having the impact of creating some empathy, I think you have certainly succeeded in doing that. I really want to thank you for the journey that you went through to uncover their story and to share it with us. I know that that was obviously not an easy journey, and I just want to say on the part of the library and for the rest of us, thank you for taking that journey and for sharing their story with us.
It's my honor. Thank you.
So we will take some questions. I encourage those on Zoom. You can type any questions or comments you may have in the chat. And then, of course, we'll take some questions here in the audience. Please note, again, we do have books for sale, and Max is going to stick around to sign books after we conclude our, there we go, our Q&A. So I'll start with a question about the title of your book. I know you were mentioning this a little bit before we started the program. So Painful Joy does seem like somewhat of a contradiction in some ways. How did you arrive at that as your title for your book?
Actually, it was by chance. I was looking, I didn't know what the title was going to be. And just through the research, I found a poem that was originally written by, I think, a Jewish poet in the Middle Ages. It was then translated and appears in the first Reformed Jewish prayer book. And it's called Painful Joy. And it's all about how love is changed when it's touched by death, how love can never be the same. And I thought about that, and I said, makes sense. And whatever love they had, which clearly I was even surprised about, was always touched by the memory of and the experience of death. So it never could be the same.
Yep. Let me just come around with the mic.
Max, that was a very moving presentation that I'll never forget. Because of the way they had to live, I don't think your parents had much to do with books. But you became a tremendous student, I know that. Not that you've ever said that, but people who know have told me. How did that come about in a house, I assume, without a lot of books?
Yeah, I think I followed my sister's example. My sister loved to read. My mother would tell her not to read and go out and be social. And it's bad for your eyes to read. You'll need glasses and all that. And so our escape from the world was reading. I was so excited one day when I got an adult card for the Brooklyn Public Library and didn't have to keep reading Random House, the landmark series of books on histories in the children's section. And so I think we both escaped. My sister escaped more through fiction. I think I escaped more through nonfiction somehow. As long as the book ended happily. That was the only point of it. But yeah, I think that's, and my parents, they didn't help us. I think my mother helped us a little bit with multiplication tables, but otherwise, we would walk up and down the boardwalk and she would recite them and then we'd get a knish at the other end. But it really was, we were very self-motivated and no one ever talked to us about our homework except maybe we were doing too much.
I always tell the story about libraries and reading. I read once that there was a small town in Pennsylvania, and it opened a library, and the first two people to get library cards were children. One was Margaret Mead, and the other was James A. Michener.
Yeah.
So the power of reading.
Yeah, well, not too shabby, no.
Thank you for the shout out to libraries there. So if anybody else has a question or comment, feel free to raise your hand. We have something.
By the way, my wife is a librarian. Just put a plug in there. No coincidence.
Okay, so I think you just mentioned this. Who is the poet who wrote the poem Painful Joy?
The one who translated it, who has the rights to it, is Chaim Stern. The original poet was Judah Halevi, the one in the Middle Ages.
So I have another question for you, Max. towards the beginning of your talk, you were talking about, I think, just the effects of the trauma that your parents went through, that they reimagined the reality of what had happened. And can you just talk a little bit more about that? Is that something that was what enabled them perhaps to survive?
Yeah, I think all my mother's stories, virtually all of them, were reimagined stories, because my mother never had fantasy was all she had. I mean, the reality was horrifying. So she lived in a world, and I think even growing up, first being a refugee at age of 4, she went to school again, to grade school through 6th grade, but she was 5 years older than everybody else. So she didn't fit in. So she told us stories about how she was the most popular person in the school. And she told stories about how she wore the most beautiful dresses. And she went to dances with boys. She couldn't go to dances with boys because she was an Orthodox Jew, and they weren't dancing with boys, dancing with wolves, if anything. So this was her way to survive. And my father, this story of his, I'm sure it was survivor's guilt. He wanted to forget everything related to what his first family, because he's telling me that he was there with them. He couldn't be there with them. He was in Bunslow, 300 miles away, and he didn't have a pass to take the train back and forth this time. And this was a kind of heavy-duty concentration camp. So he made that was his way of saying goodbye to his wife and to his children, and not remembering them, trying to forget them forever. And 20 minutes, that was it for him. Couldn't take more.
So did you have any hints of those being sort of reimagined realities before you began your research?
No, I don't think so. I think we believed our parents. I mean, I wrote this op-ed piece on Father's Day in 2004 about my father, that last moment when he was together with his wife. In his head, he was together with his wife. And we sort of believed them. And and going through the research, things became less real than they seemed to be. My mother and her fantasy about the dance studio, we believed her forever. Why not? Who knows? I don't know. I didn't know anything about Krakow. I didn't know anything. Yeah. Why not? And why not is because it wasn't.
I just want to say, nowadays with technology, nothing gets lost, but I'm just very impressed with your perseverance and diligence in how you found the little crumbs and scraps and the research that you did to put together this history and find the truth. It's really, I want to compliment you on that.
Every time I found something, I would call my sister and tell her, I just found out this, I just found out that. She said, really? Really? And yeah, it was exciting to find anything to put the story together, because you want to know who you are, and you have to look at your parents to know some of that. And we looked at our parents and we said, oh my God, is this who we needed to know?
So was your sister involved in helping research the book, or was she?
No, my sister, and I think she's watching. Hello, Rachel. I think she's on this call. My sister would rather have not known. My sister had a harder time. And she was the daughter. This was the mother. She was the older one. She got the brunt of the psychological distress, of the emotional distress that my parents were exhibiting all the time. And I think, she when my father and mother fought and my father ran out of the house, she was worried that he would ever come back. She was afraid he wouldn't come back. And then what would we do? No, there was no one there for us. My mother didn't work. So, no, I think my sister was okay with just having this be a past that wasn't revisited. But I think she, with grandchildren and with children, I think she got to appreciate the idea that it's good to know the story of where you came from and who you you know, and what even DNA you may have that you've inherited. My grandson is here, and you know, he's the one who helped spark the idea of me doing that when he asked me about survival and about DNA, and did he have any survival genes in him. And that in 2016, when he was like 7 or 8, that sparked me to say, it's time for me to do something more.
Well, again, I have to say this is it's a very moving, very personal, very powerful story that you've shared with us, and I know there's much more even, I'm sure, to tell and to share about it. So would you say, I mean, just to kind of wrap things up here, that finding out the real true story and understanding where you come from, and understanding that there is, you know, future generations that will be able to understand that, is that sort of the happy ending to this story?
Yeah, I think that, and the thing that I take away from this is how, you know, one day everything could be okay, and the next day everything can turn upside down and backwards, and you know, I think my happy ending is a better appreciation for now than for tomorrow or for yesterday. That's the way I have come to look at the world, because you just never know. They didn't know. I asked one guy once, a researcher, I said, why did my father get married in the middle of all this craziness? You know, it's 1937, you know, the Kristallnacht is gonna, you know, all this stuff is happening all around. And he said, what did you expect him to do? I mean, he needed to get on with his life. That was his life. So, yeah, the happy ending is knowing more about your past and realizing how people can adapt to the worst of times, you know, and some people do survive. Maybe some people survive and it's okay. Some people survive with wounds, but they still, you know, there is still joy to be had. And even for them, my father would light up when he would see his children and his grandchildren. It would be the best thing. And even when he lost his memory, he kept that emotion of love. So that's pretty powerful.
Agreed.
I just have a comment. Like, because of the news, the only thing I ever watch or read, other than reading and watching the news, I only choose to read and watch things that have happy endings.
Good for
But
you.
I'm glad I came to this. If it weren't for Amy,
All
I
right,
wouldn't
well,
have. I'm so glad I came.
Well,
Thank
again,
you.
the happy ending is my grandson and my sister's grandchildren and children. Those are the happy endings, right?
Absolutely. Well, let's have another round of applause for Max Friedman.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here, and thank you, everybody on Zoom.